Petroleum says parliamentary approval is required first.
The Supreme Court ruling means the government will have to get parliamentary approval for stake sale in all companies created by an act of parliament. While the government has a majority in the Lok Sabha, it has to win over its own allies first. The HPBP privatization has faced strong opposition from within, not least from Petroleum Minister Ram Naik, who wants to retain both companies.
Can be beneficial in all the ways that these two companies have their intrinsic value. And if they remain with the government with their intrinsic value, the economy will be benefited.
The government has already avoided voting on the issue in the last parliament session. With no majority in the Rajya Sabha and this being an election year, this appears to be the end of the road for privatization of HPCL and BPCL.
The man most affected by the decision was far away from it all. Disinvestment Minister Arun Shourie was in Germany and had to engage in a long-distance debate.
Disinvestment Minister Arun Shourie in Berlin at the time was clearly despondent. A pessimistic Shourie told CNBC TV 18 that this was the end of the road for divestment.
No, I don't see the disinvestment taking place at all. We have stopped all work on it.
When asked what the next course of action would be, Shourie seemed undecided.
I don't know what the next course would be. We would have to wait for the meeting of the CCD on the 3rd of October, by which time, after consulting the Ministry of Law and the Attorney General, we will put up a paper which sets out the options for government.
2 days later, after going through the court judgment in detail, Shourie was in a more combative mood. He said the ruling could lead to a re-examination of all government divestments since 1991.
If you say HPCL, BPCL cannot be disinvested without parliamentary approval because there is a constitutional provision about parliamentary approval for expenditures, and all the money spent on these companies and all the dividends got from these companies are connected with the Consolidated Fund of India, then that holds true of all public sector companies.
Shourie argues that the Nationalisation Act was framed just to nationalise government companies. Subsequent decisions relating to HPCL and BPCL were not included in the Act as both companies were brought under the Companies Act.
HPCL and BPCL were also under the Companies Act, which they are. And the initial acts were only the acts for taking over. They were not for what the companies do later on. These companies were then incorporated under the Companies Act.
Well, that's Disinvestment Minister Arun Shourie from Germany. Earlier, we asked constitutional lawyer Ramjethmalani for his view on the point that anything paid for from the Consolidated Fund needs approval from Parliament before being sold.
If an asset has been created by a statute of Parliament and the statute carries an assumption that the asset will continue to exist in that form, then any modification requires parliamentary approval.
Well, joining me now from his chambers is senior Supreme Court advocate and Congress spokesperson Abhishek Singhvi. Mr. Singhvi, thank you very much for joining us. Quickly, do you share the pessimism of Mr. Arun Shourie when he says that this could open up the whole gamut of disinvestments from 71 onwards?
No, I don't. And I think with great respect to him, and I do really like Mr. Shourie, I think it's a certain amount of contrived pessimism, because perhaps in his urge to hasten the disinvestment process, he wants to paint the picture so black merely because a considered Supreme Court verdict has come.
Well, let me then find out from you, why is Maruti different and why is HPCL, BPCL different?
Well, several reasons. First and foremost, Maruti is a consummated transaction. Maruti is over long ago. Why should Mr. Shourie, who is defending the disinvestment process, seek to expand by even suggesting that Maruti can or should be reopened? Certainly in law, in fact, in equity, in legal adjudication, a consummated transaction completed many years ago will stand on a different footing than a transaction in the pipeline or doing in the future.
Well, what about Mr. Shourie's argument then that when the Supreme Court refers to the Consolidated Fund of India, then almost every, even a single share that is bought or created in a government company gets created from the Consolidated Fund of India. Is that an overstretched argument?
Reason that every sentence or every word in the Supreme Court judgment does not constitute its ratio. The Supreme Court judgment's ratio is very clear. This ratio, this principle, this conclusion will apply only in situations where there is a direct analog with Section 7 of a Takeover Act, of a Nationalization Act. Now, the first and the foremost point to be made is that out of the total array of those companies waiting to be disinvested as per Mr. Shourie, a very small percentage would fall in the direct Section 7 BPCL mode. Thirdly and more importantly, I think it is wrong to assume that anybody who speaks in a cautious way about disinvestment is per se perceived to be against disinvestment. For example, I hear Mr. Shourie saying anybody in India has a veto, in China one doesn't. Now I ask myself here, apart from me, I think with respect slightly contumacious of the Supreme Court verdict, but that apart, here the veto, if one might use that word, is found in a statute in Section 7 and in the Supreme Court's interpretation of Section 7. It's not as if every man on the street has been exercising vetoes against Mr. Shourie's disinvestment for the last few years.
Right. You know, why, for instance, has the Supreme Court not taken cognizance of the fact that when these companies were privatized in the early 70s, or when these companies were nationalized in the early 70s, the fact is it was a technical requirement since the marketing operation of one of these companies was based in the US, so the government had to go through nationalization. It wasn't as if that was the preferred route the government chose.
I think, Raghav, there are two aspects to it. And the first is in the nature of a preliminary objection. You know, there is a system in this country and in legal systems all over the world of finality. We are not here to discuss, in a sense, whether the Supreme Court judgment is right or wrong. We could discuss that partly for the High Court judgment, but there is a finality attached to it.
Okay.
And there are only very limited known ways of altering that finality. It is not final. It can be changed by Mr. Shourie's government, but by only following a certain procedure.
Right.
I dare say many judgments of the Supreme Court have appealed against, maybe altered. But it's not really open. We are now discussing a given. The given is a apex court judgment which has to be implemented. Certainly there could be so many versions. I mean, it's probably a different context, a different case, a different company, even a different bench could perhaps have taken a different view.
Mr. Singhvi, towards the last 30 seconds of this, what will now the Congress do? Will you use the enhanced parliamentary scrutiny of the disinvestment process
to perhaps... It clear that I've done several times. It is really putting a point in our mouth and shooting it down. We've never been against disinvestment per se. But yes, whenever a parliamentary situation like Section 7 comes up, and it is limited only to those Section 7 situations, we will exercise our full parliamentary right to debate. In some cases on an evaluation we may oppose, in some we may not. But it's a little hypothetical and unusual for Mr. Shourie's government to raise this even without presenting a bill, the content of which we haven't seen.
Mr. Singhvi, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Well, time for a break now, but still ahead.